We will now begin the Q&A session. For those of you in the audience, you can submit questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. If you have a question, please introduce yourself, indicate who you'd like the question addressed to. I have someone helping me sort through the questions. We might not be able to get to every question because we have quite a few people joining us today, but we'll do our best to answer as many as possible and respond to those we don't get to after the event. So our first question is for Michael Clare. Does the US Congress have access to US nuclear targeting plans? And how can the US public know if the strike options available to the president include catastrophic massive attack plans?
I would say that members of Congress don't have access to the secret plans. And after I speak, I think I'll ask Tom Countryman to add to this because he may know more about it, about the specific question. But Congress certainly knows about the doctrine that lies behind these targeting decisions. The national defense strategy, the nuclear posture review that include the policy of targeting China and Russia with massive numbers of nuclear weapons. They're aware of the doctrine that makes that possible. But I think that Tom Countryman might have more specific answers. The actual target arrays, that would be highly secret information that nobody else would have outside of a few people within the Defense Department.
So Danny, if you want, I'll comment briefly on that question. The Congress does not have regular, ordinary access to the SIOP, which is the various strike options that the president would have. I believe it is important to support those in Congress who have requested more regular briefings so that Congress is at least forced to confront the reality that all of the strike plans result in massive casualties, not just at the target, in the targets of US weapons, but in the United States itself. The questioner asked is how can the public be reassured that there are no massive strike plans? You can't, because it absolutely does include plans for massive retaliation.
Danny, if I might.
Yes, please.
The situation is actually significantly worse than people imagine in this regard. We know on the record that there was, in fact, a Senate closed session on a classified briefing on the US nuclear war plan by the head of Strategic Command some years ago. And Senator Bob Kerrey, who was there, actually publicly complained on the floor of the Senate after this briefing, in which Senator Kerrey said that the briefers from Strategic Command, the people in charge of the nuclear weapons and the nuclear war plans, were unable or unwilling to give the information that the senators asked for. And senators were given 3 different answers to the question about the war plans and the consequences. They were told that the briefers had not brought that information. Then they were told that the senators were not cleared to receive such classified information. And then they were told that this information had in fact been provided to Senate leadership and to members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And then Kerry revealed that the members of the leadership and the Senate Armed Services Committee had never in fact received any such information. And my colleague, Bruce Blair, who some of you may know, who sadly passed away, revealed in 2019, so basically 2 years ago, that this is the first and only joint Democratic Republican Senate hearing to even receive a classified briefing on the US nuclear war plan. And what we know from Senator Kerry is that basically they were not given anything that resembled an answer to the questions they asked. So there is a deliberate process of preventing democratically elected leaders in the United States from understanding and being able to make decisions about the US nuclear war plan.
Thank you. Our next question is for Beatrice. Is it probable that countries like Ireland that have made the TPNW actual domestic law may eventually arrest the leaders of nuclear weapons makers, or for that matter, politicians from nuclear weapons countries when they step onto the soil of the TPNW states' parties? Can this be emphasized and implemented?
Hi. Yeah, thank you for a really great question, which is somehow connected to a little bit to the question about the International Criminal Court and war crimes and countries having an obligation to arrest leaders that have committed war crimes, for example. The TPNW is in the current way and in the current way that the national legislation for most TPNW states that have ratified the treaty does not stretch that far. I think that's quite a high bar in terms of, in particular in the case where nuclear weapons, these leaders have not used nuclear weapons, right? Like I think that it will be quite a high bar for those countries. And I think that we have to also recognize the fact that it's, in many ways, the richest countries, some of the most powerful countries in the world that have these weapons, making it quite difficult for a small country, for example, to take those kind of actions towards a very big, military powerful, very rich country that are very dependent on trade. We've already seen in the process how these nuclear armed states have used significant pressure to get countries to not ratify the treaty, threatening to cancel trade negotiations, threatening to stop military collaborations if they even just ratify the treaty. So to be honest, I think that there's limited impact in getting countries to act in that far. But there are, of course, ways to increase the pressure and increase the sort of stigma around these activities. And we're hoping that these countries that have ratified the treaty will speak out louder. We now argue, and campaigners in these countries will argue, that they have an obligation to raise it at the UN Security Council when they have a seat there, in the Human Rights Council. We have, the annual UN debate on gender now in March at the UN, for example. We argue that governments, the states parties to the treaty, should bring up the gendered impact of nuclear radiation, for example, in those forums. We argue that they should go in bilateral meetings in the way that, for example, as a Swede, I say that the Swedish government in trade negotiation with China, we should talk about human rights violation, we should talk about all these kind of issues with the countries that are doing problematic behavior. And we see how that actually influences these countries. There's a reason why China gets very upset when you bring up human rights. There's a reason why Saudi Arabia gets very upset when you bring up women's rights, for example, in these forums. And it's because that pressure, it works and it bothers them, and it doesn't leave, it leaves, it makes sure that we don't leave that unquestioned. And I think that also ties together with many of the conversation here about what to do and how to get politicians to act. It's not just about winning over every single person. It's also about raising the discomfort level. It's been too easy for politicians, and particularly in a country like the United States, to support threatening to mass murder civilians with weapons of mass destruction. And what we're trying to do is not to think that we can change people's minds very quickly or change these governments' minds, but to continue to raise what is acceptable, continue to disturb them, continue to make it harder and difficult and uncomfortable to invest in these weapons, to authorize budgets that we can, this is the power we have. We can't change Donald Trump's mind or Putin's mind or something like that. It's really hard for us to do that, but we can kind of continuously just raise the bar of what's acceptable, and that's in our power to do. So I think that this is a kind of an ongoing process, and ideally we would end up in a situation where every country that has joined this treaty would take such strong actions, put them on blacklist the countries. But I think that's too early now. So it's one of those things that we're working to kind of get them to speak out more and more and more and raise the bar for the actions they take.
Thank you very much. Our next question is for Denise. Denise, what advice do you have for folks who may not be connected with a local organization, but really want to work on this issue and have an impact locally? Are there ways that individuals can help build support among local and state officials and other opinion leaders in our communities?
Absolutely. And in fact, that's one of the things that Back from the Brink wants to try to do, is to bring people together. So on our website, we have an interactive map that will show you which organizations have endorsed, where there's resolutions that have happened or are pending. But if you send us an email at info@preventnuclearwar.org, we can, one, help you connect you to organizations that are in your community that you may not know are there. And we can also work with you on what the process is to begin just approaching. You have power. You have an elected, somebody represents you in your city council, somebody represents you in the state, and that's the most powerful voice there is. So please send us an email at info@preventnuclearwar.org. That is one of our favorite kind of emails, and we have had some success doing that.
Great. Thank you so much, Denise. Excuse me. Our next question is for Zia. The next nuclear posture review is being developed right now. What avenues are there for arms control and abolition advocates to influence the elements of the NPR?
The normal process for developing a nuclear posture review is actually fairly closely held. It's not open for public comment or review or participation. And so that's part of the democratic shortfall in nuclear policy making that has emerged in some of the earlier conversation, that there is actually a professional bureaucratic machinery that lives inside the US government and in all the other countries with nuclear weapons, whose job it is to create these policies, rationalizations, justifications, budgets, and to engineer the weapons. And so how advocates for the abolition of nuclear weapons can participate in this is to think about how to tackle this entire machinery rather than worry about one particular nuclear posture review document, because these things come and go. The machine that generates these things should be the focus of attention. Because what it does, and if you read all the nuclear policy reviews of the United States going back the various past administrations, you'll quickly find, as Tom Countryman mentioned earlier, changes are actually incremental. They're not radical changes, even though you might think an administration is fundamentally different than the one that came before. And a close reading of the Obama administration's posture review shows that it's not fundamentally that different from the Trump administration's posture review on many, many issues. And so I think the issue that we have to ask, and the right question is to ask, is what do we do about the nuclear policy making machine that we confront, rather than any particular policy report or document that they produce? And the first part of that is to begin to understand where it lives and how it insulates itself from democratic control. Because what happens is that basically a finished report ends up in the hands of the White House and in Congress and on a website somewhere. And the process of authorship in detail of who wrote what paragraph, who was responsible, who was in the individual meetings where all of this was put in place, is not available in the public domain. And as part of what Beatrice was mentioning, if you're going to make people uncomfortable, if you're going to hold them to account, then it would be really good to have a process to push for nuclear policy review making processes to be as transparent as possible, so everybody can see who wrote what, who was in the meeting where it was decided it's okay, in Beatrice's words, to have so many weapons that commit mass murder, and let them explain to their children, to their families, to their communities, and to everybody else, this is what I did today.
Danny, unmute.
Oh, I apologize. Sorry about that. Thank you, Zia. Our next question somewhat relates to that. It's for Tom. Mr. Countryman, please comment on the role of defense contractors in persuading politicians to continue funding new nuclear weapons programs. How important is the money trail?
In my opinion, the money trail is everything in politics. And I think that it has only gotten worse in recent years. I hope that Mr. Biden's stated priority to fight corruption overseas extends also to greater transparency at home. Certainly the contributions of defense firms, not only to political campaigns, but to think tanks and to spokesmen, is an important factor. It would be a mistake, however, to assume that if you simply shine a light on all of the money that flows from the federal government to defense contractors, to defense executives, and then back into congressional campaigns, that would be sufficient to address the question. It is not helpful to question the integrity of every member of Congress who has a strong belief about national security. You have to make the argument on the merits as well, on the steps that will increase rather than decrease our security, and on the question of affordability. What investments in national security, which should be understood to be much broader than military questions, it should include health and environmental questions. What investments in national security are urgent and what can we afford? That's where the battle is going to be won or not. If I could, Danny, seize this to answer another couple of questions very briefly that are in the Q&A. One is about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is very important. In that treaty, which has now been in effect for 51 years, there was created a legal obligation for the 5 nuclear weapon states to work for the abolition of all nuclear weapons. The U.S. has always accepted that legal obligation, but for the last 4 years has not talked about it. It is the very most minimum step that the Biden administration can take to reaffirm that this is a legal obligation that we have to work towards. It's not enough to point out that since the treaty was signed, we have eliminated 85% of the nuclear weapons that once existed. That's good, but it does not relieve the legal obligation to go further. The relationship between the Prohibition Treaty and the NPT is important. There has been a tendency from Washington and Moscow and Paris for the last 4 years to attack aggressively the advocates of the TPNW, and that it somehow detracts from the importance of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's not only wrong logically, it's counterproductive rhetorically. And I have some hope that the Biden administration will stop bad-mouthing the efforts of more than 100 countries around the world to make a real contribution to the goal of abolition of nuclear weapons. And I hope that all advocates of the treaty, of the Prohibition Treaty, will affirm the central role of that other treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and avoid this false description of a conflict between the two.
Yes, thank you very much. Our next question is for Michael. What is the current status of the INF Treaty in US government policy, and how critical is reviving this treaty to preventing nuclear war today?
Well, the INF Treaty was abolished Trump administration withdrew from it, and then Mr. Putin did the same. So the INF Treaty is no longer in force. I think it's essential to revive it in some other form. Now, China was not a member of the INF Treaty, and China has a lot of intermediate range weapons of that sort that could be covered by a new treaty. So it won't be possible to revive a treaty like that, especially one including China, without the kind of intense talks that Tom Countryman was talking about earlier, of bringing first the US and Russian leaders together for intensive talks and discussions about security threats, and then hopefully extending those talks to include China. The reason why I think this is so important is, as I indicated earlier in my talk, is that all three countries are developing weapons that would have been prohibited by the INF Treaty and pose a very severe threat of bridging the gap between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons, especially hypersonic weapons, which would reduce, because they're so fast, would reduce decision time from 30 minutes with an intercontinental ballistic missile to 5 minutes or 10 minutes for a country that's coming under attack to determine whether it's a nuclear weapon or not, or a conventional weapon, and to decide whether or not to launch its own weapons. So you have a risk where countries will be forced to, or could decide to, put their nuclear weapons on a launch on warning status and have very few minutes to decide whether or not to launch them, and may decide to launch them prematurely. So we get to a much more dangerous environment, which explains why the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved their clock closer. So it's very important that, as Tom Countryman said, that US and Russian and US and Chinese, and hopefully all three, conduct these security talks about these new weapons and try to revive an INF treaty or something like it.
Thank you. Our next question is for Beatrice. Do you see any common ground between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states to get rid of their nuclear weapons? What does that solidarity look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there's a strong feeling amongst the public in pretty much all over the world. And I think that there's some common ground in terms of nobody wants to see nuclear war. I think that's pretty given. Nobody, nobody wants to actually use nuclear weapons. But then, of course, there's still a huge gap between the people that think it's still legitimate to possess them and threaten with them and have them as a power tool, and the ones that don't think that's a legitimate option. And I think that very often we've had the conversations only on the nuclear armed states terms. And to me, this is so similar to all the other conversations where you have a very powerful actor and people that are less powerful in that context, right? And the people in power gets to dominate the conversation. They get to be the ones that their perspective take precedence. And I think that's one of the most significant contributions of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that it has empowered countries without nuclear weapons to have a voice. Because I think it's really important in particular for people maybe in nuclear armed states, to understand that this is my security too, right? This is, I'm a Swede in Switzerland, me and my family and my country will be impacted if there's nuclear war too. And the fact I never consented to the US and Russia deciding my fate, right? I don't get to vote. I don't get to be a part of those kind of conversations. So in many ways, it's also it's kind of an obligation for other people to think about the consequences that they have on other countries. Sia talked about the research that's shown India and Pakistan, for example, the fact that can knock out food production for decades in advance. means that this is the responsibility for everyone. And in that way, it's very similar to the climate change conversation. You can't just say that, okay, my country will do the right thing, but let's ignore the other ones. Like, it doesn't work like that. This threat does not know borders. It doesn't stop at borders. It doesn't stop with generations. It will continue for the next generations as well. So I think that's something that the nuclear armed states, both the politicians and also the public in those countries, need to really think about. And to kind of understand that their decision is actually having a huge impact on others. I think it's also really important to remember that the majority of countries in the world do not have nuclear weapons. It's very easy to talk about it as they have existed, you know, they will always exist, there's no other options. For pretty much all other countries in the world, they are having their security, you know, dealt with without threatening to use weapons of mass destruction. So that's also one of those things, sort of starting points. I think also there's, of course, a huge amount of common ground in that there is a recognition from everyone that more nuclear weapons isn't more secure. I mean, that's why we have the non-proliferation treaty. That's why we like the world recognize, even the nuclear armed state recognize that, you know, everyone having nuclear weapons isn't actually a good idea. And I think that that inherently kind of also recognizes that deterrence isn't flawless. I think that's also very important to remember that even the nuclear armed states, even the one, you know, they don't want other countries to have nuclear weapons because they recognize that if nuclear weapons meant peace, then why don't we all have it? So I think it's really those kind of things I think we can talk about. I think it's really important to start questioning this kind of almost religious belief in that nuclear weapons are great for us, but not for others. And all that also stems from, I saw a couple of questions about the racism and that thing. I think it also comes from a very sort of a privileged point of view that we are responsible with these weapons and others are not responsible. And you can trust us, mainly Western countries, white countries, and, you know, Middle Eastern countries or African countries would be very dangerous with nuclear weapons. You know, why do we think that North Korea is more dangerous with nuclear weapons than the United States? I mean, so far North Korea has not used nuclear weapons and the United States did. So I think that the kind of thinking around who gets to take these decisions need to change. So yeah, I think that there's obviously a lot of conversations that need to happen, but the fundamental challenge for the nuclear armed states will be to kind of recognize that this is not a sustainable situation for the long term, and at some point, someone is going to have to get rid of nuclear weapons. If we keep them forever, they will eventually be used, right? So someone in the United States eventually has to make the decision that, yeah, we should get rid of these. So the question is, are we going to do it now? Or are we going to wait for catastrophe to happen, for nuclear war to happen? Are we going to do it after? I think the pandemic has shown again, like, how it's so easy to postpone these things. Everyone knew that a pandemic was going to come. The scientists knew, the experts knew. Same thing with scientists and experts know that the risk of nuclear war is increasing. Eventually it will happen if we don't do it. So are we going to do it now? Are we going to leave it to our kids, their kids? Someone is going to have to step up and do it.
Thank you so much. This has been so informative. And unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to give a big thank you to all of our panelists, Zia Mian, Michael Clare, Beatrice Finn, Denise Duffield, and Tom Countryman for an excellent Q&A session. And I want to thank all of you in our audience for your great questions. We will make a recording of the panel discussion and Q&A available on the Back from the Brink website in the near future, and slides will be available on the Back from the Brink site as well.